Ladies, gentlemen, and exiles of all ages, last week I was invited down by the lovely people at Grinding Gear Games to have a particularly early look and hands-on experience with Path of Exile 2, alongside a bunch of other content creators. That's right, I've actually played the game myself now, and not on some on-rails experience or something like that, but let out freely at the start of the game to go where I would and just experience what there is to see. With the exception that I did only have access to 3 classes, being the Warrior, the Ranger, and the Sorceress. So today I'm going to talk about multiple things related to my experience at this early event, as well as some particularly major news that they actually told us about while we were there, and then I'll just talk about my thoughts on the game at this stage from my experience with it. And again, a really big thanks to Grinding Gear Games for bringing me out down there to do this. The first main piece of information before we dive into anything else then, the open public beta for the game was originally announced to be happening in June of this year, but due to a bunch of the recent changes that they've actually made to the game, requiring some pretty major overhauls, this public beta has been delayed as of now a fair bit, now not having a specific date but being planned for the final few months of the year, as opposed to originally being, in the summer. Instead, in the summer, there will be a more limited, more private alpha test happening for the game. The main cause of this is actually the result of the most recently announced new class for the game, the Mercenary. This class is heavily based around different types of shot types with crossbows, almost acting like an FPS class with guns entering an RPG and a medieval concept, which is a really cool idea for a class. But one of the earliest reactions that the developers had while they were building this class was just the thought that it would be sort of cool if you could shoot the crossbow while you were moving, because the gameplay that they were making for this class just felt a bit too static otherwise. It just sort of fit what they were going for. So they stopped and they built that in, and they realized it sort of actually felt way too good with Mercenary to have just be on Mercenary, and so they stopped and said, hey, let's just make this a basic game mechanic, so now every class in the game can move while attacking. Every caster can cast while moving, unless it is a channeled spell, and the result is that it changes the pace of an ARPG dramatically, and that in itself created a unique experience compared to a lot of similar games that I've played. As well, there is the dodge roll, of course, that we've already known about, but getting my own hands on with it really helped me appreciate how big of a deal it actually is in a game like this. And what I can say is there is an overarching feeling in this game of deliberateness in Path of Exile 2, and the changes to its combat from the first game. At least in the lower levels for sure, where I got to experience here, where you do have less options and less power as a player. Your dodge timing and positioning will matter a hell of a lot more, and the way that you maneuver to kite enemies is actually quite important, especially if you don't want to get the attention of a whole other pack of enemies, because at least in my preview here where I was playing the new Sorceress class, I found if things actually managed to catch up to me, I was pretty much dead already. Though again, this was quite early level compared to what the full game will be. There were multiple bosses that I also came across along my journey, and only one of them I beat in a singular attempt. The rest actually had interesting mechanics to learn, because I just sort of underestimated them as being story bosses. I expected them to fold and just sort of let me keep walking over them, but they each had their own sort of unique telegraphs, things like that actually significantly reward you for respecting them and learning their animations even at this early stage in the game. It says a lot to me that even these early bosses are the first few levels actually feel somewhat impactful, relatively speaking. They actually feel like they've had some actual input put into their movesets. Then there is this guy. This boss I spent a good 30 minutes on in multiple attempts, and maybe that sounds embarrassing to some, but it was a triumph to actually get to, and I have to say it was a ridiculous feeling of satisfaction when I actually did manage to kill him. He wasn't a main quest blocker, he wasn't a thing that I needed to do to experience more of the game in this preview. He wasn't a part of the story itself, but they left us free to follow our will. He was just sort of a side objective, part of a side quest that I'd wandered myself into, and I'd found myself in this fight and found something that actually just really engaged the part of my lizard brain that takes a lot of pride in my ability to use dodges with iframes and tactics to overpower statistical differences and overcome difficult fights. After a few attempts, I could tell pretty easily by my damage itself that I was probably a bit in over my head. I probably wasn't expected to actually kill this specific boss at this point in time. I just wandered over here early, and yet I could also feel tangibly that it was doable, that it was possible, because the game has these skill-based things, like the actual dodge with proper iframes, and the actual block where you can fully block attacks if you actually manage to stamina bar correctly, gives this game a lot more of an actual skill ceiling than just a statistical ceiling, which most ARPGs as the genre tend to have, at least this style of them. A lot of the time, if your character is built correctly, you will get through the path in front of you will get through the enemies, and it will be as simple as that. There's not a whole lot of else to it. There can be some skill and positioning and stuff like that, but they're not generally overly skill-based compared to a equipment based, whereas Path of Exile 2, with the experience I've had with these new mechanics, feels like there's a lot more skill that you can actually take advantage of in this game, and it can make a lot bigger difference for you while playing it, which is actually a really big deal. It almost feels like a Souls-like encounter in that way, but in a top-down systems-based ARPG. On top of the changes allowing movement while shooting, they also added WASD movement for keyboard and mouse, allowing for a lot more control, especially for moving while also attacking, and letting you aim in directions that you aren't actively walking in as well. And it just made for more purposeful and deliberate gameplay as a result. Obviously, you can still play with the classic control scheme too, moving around with your mouse clicks, but personally I felt like WASD movement actually properly fit with the new playstyle of this sequel. Another major departure that they are making is also heading further into the action side of ARPGs, is a full overhaul on how shields work as a concept in the game. As well, while we have seen warriors a bit in action, the new class, the public footage before this point was all with two-handed weapons, big, gigantic whacking sticks, whereas we were instead, in this private event, shown a warrior wielding a one-handed sword and shield, and this was to show us the actual changes to shields as a whole. As you might be seeing in my boss fight footage here on the sorceress, to go hand in hand with directional aiming and being able to move while also performing an action, there's now actually an active block skill with your shields that you can use if you have one. The downside to this is it takes up one of the slots on your bar of skills, and it takes up attention in your brain to actually have to use it on the right time. And of course, obviously it means that you have to use a shield as part of your equipment, and while in early game that probably won't change a whole lot, it does mean it probably won't be so viable to do, at least with it like a sorcerer with shield in the deep end game, as much as I do enjoy the concept. And the reason that I enjoy it is very simple. Active block. What this skill does then is specifically, while you are holding it down, you will hold the shield up in the direction that your cursor is facing. If an attack hits you from that direction while you are blocking, you will be fully 100% immune. Not to mention that doing this interrupts any animation that you are in. If you press the block button, you will stop what you are doing, hold up the block, and you will be immune to the attack hitting you from that direction. Simple as that, nothing else to it really, except for a stamina gauge we'll get to in a minute, I guess. But the fact is, it gives you no damage at all. No RNG. It is a guaranteed full block in this style of game. It is massive for this. I've never seen something like this in this type of game. And again, it makes it feel far more deliberate in its combat than its counterparts. The other big part for this system is that it does have a sort of poise meter, as stamina bars I was mentioning, where if you block enough attacks too soon after each other, with too little of a break in between, you have a sort of guard break mini stun that lets you get hit for free. But the fact that you can use this against some really meaty hits even from bosses is absolutely phenomenal. I blocked tons of hits that would do most of my health in damage during this fight, as an example. The only real exception for this is that there are attacks that will be specifically unblockable that some enemies will have, as well as bosses, obviously. These are anything that originates from the sky, like a rain of arrows, for example, things that originate from the ground, like traps or spells that are ground targeted, or telegraphs, where enemies flash red, like they do in fighting games with blocks to indicate a non-blockable attack, which is a really nice way to actually include that. As far as the skills and general standard Path of Exile stuff like the skill gems, again, my gameplay was quite early on, so relatively limited, but my experience was generally positive with it all. I didn't get to unlock any support gems, I didn't get that far in, I just had raw skill gems, but even with the minimal passive tree progress that I had as well as just a few basic skills, I was given the ability to choose which of these basic skills I wanted to unlock along the way, and I used this to create the basis of a sort of synergy, a sort of build, a combination that suited each other beautifully well in ways that I consider really impressive for just base skill synergies, not even involving the support gems or items or anything of the sort. The setup then was Shock, which released a bunch of little bolts of lightning around you, but specifically because at melee or near melee range, this works like a sort of shotgun blast of lightning, where all the hits will hit the enemy because they are on top of the spawn locations for them. We paired this with Static Orb, which you place on the ground and it lasts for a very long time where you place it. If you cast electric attacks near the orb, it will replicate them in a sort of way, firing out bonus electric shocks from the orb itself for every lightning spell that you cast near it. So every time we cast shock near the orb, it gets a bonus shock, essentially. Then we also had Firewall, and Firewall has a unique base effect where any projectile that passes through it gains fire damage, but also just gains pure raw damage as a whole. So the idea is Static Orb, Firewall on top of the Static Orb, then fire a bunch of shocks while standing in it to make every projectile we spawn create more projectiles and have all of those get the added fire damage as well from going through the wall, and just pummeling all of that into our enemies all in one moment. And overall, I think this synergy worked absolutely beautifully for me, which in itself I was very happy to get to see happen in front of my eyes. Overall, I would say my experience trying the game out in its current state was overwhelmingly positive. The majority of the things that I want to say about it, I already have really. All about how much more active and deliberate the combat feels in this style of game compared to the competitors, with an active dodge roll and active blocking on shields as well. Attacking while moving, all of that really adds to the more unique and standout feel of this. The downsides then, honestly, the ones that I saw, at least the only ones really, were polish based. And that's simply to say, I have nothing to accurately point out as being like a bad mechanic, nothing that made me particularly unhappy to engage with. The only real issues that I had were very clearly just things that need ironing out, like sometimes mob speed was a bit quick in a situation where the game seemed to want me to kite them around. Sometimes the flask recharges seemed to work a bit inconsistently compared to how they worked in the first game, but I think most of that type of stuff can easily be chalked up to a mix of bugs or just things that are still being fiddled with as far as final numbers go. So again, it's important to remember that this video started by me mentioning that the game is now being delayed a few more months before they even do the beta, because they just saw a way to genuinely make the whole game better as a base at the cost of a bit more development time. And they've gone with it. They made the decision to do it. And I absolutely love that they're a company willing to do that. And I think it's gonna pay off here. Sure, we will have to wait a bit longer to get our hands on the beta properly, but trust me, from my little hands-on with it myself, the little bit that I got, the changes that this caused this delay, it will be more than worth it. And I am really looking forward to getting to experience more of the game at this point. That just about does it then, really, everyone. Just a bit of a talk about the news that was shared with us at this private event, as well as a talk about my impressions of the game that I had after playing it myself. What I find particularly unique, and especially the more new mechanics we were given to play around with, and how they feel in this genre of game. Again, my feelings were overwhelmingly positive. I think it has a few rough edges, sure, but it definitely has multiple months to sort those out before we even enter the beta for the game at this point, so I think we can definitely look forward to it actually being ironed out. I hope you've enjoyed this video then, and hopefully it has helped give you a bit more of an insight into the current state of Path of Exile 2. Like if you liked the video, subscribe with the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet. Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.